From accidentally getting sent a plane ticket to Hollywood instead of a phone call, to living in the same building where John Lennon was murdered, Lauren Bacall's life was filled with bizarre coincidences and shocking secrets that even her biggest fans don't know. The sultry screen siren who taught Humphrey Bogart how to whistle had a medical condition named after her, was related to an Israeli prime minister, and didn't receive her first Oscar nomination until she was 72 years old. Here are 15 things you never knew about Lauren Bacall. Fact 1. Her famous voice was completely fake. That legendary husky voice that made Lauren Bacall one of Hollywood's most recognizable stars was completely artificial, and creating it nearly destroyed her vocal cords in the process. When 19-year-old Betty Joan Persky first auditioned for director Howard Hawks in 1943, she had a high-pitched nasal voice that was typical for young women from the Bronx. Hawks was so put off by her natural speaking voice that he initially dismissed her from consideration entirely, telling her she would never make it in Hollywood with such an unappealing sound. But Hawks saw potential in her striking looks and gave her one last chance, under the condition that she completely transform how she spoke. He assigned her to work with a voice coach and gave her very specific instructions on how to develop what would become her signature sound. For 2 solid weeks, Bacall spent hours every single day shouting verses from Shakespeare at the top of her lungs, deliberately forcing her voice into an unnaturally low register. The training was so intense and demanding that it caused permanent changes to her vocal cords and throat muscles. Hawks also instructed her to practice by reading entire books aloud in her car, maintaining that artificially low pitch for hours at a time. She would drive around Los Angeles reciting The Robe and other novels, never allowing her voice to slip back into its natural range. The result was what critics later described as a smoky sexual growl and a throaty purr that became inseparable from her screen persona. This extreme vocal training created lasting damage that both she and Humphrey Bogart would suffer from for the rest of their lives. The medical condition that results from habitually speaking outside your natural vocal range is now officially called Bogart-Bacall syndrome, named after the 2 actors who famously developed it. Fact 2. She got discovered by accident. Lauren Bacall's entire Hollywood career happened because of a secretary who completely misunderstood a simple phone message, turning what should have been a routine business call into one of the most famous discovery stories in movie history. In 1943, 18-year-old Betty Persky was working as a fashion model in New York when she appeared on the cover of Harper's Bazaar magazine. The photo caught the attention of Nancy "Slim" Hawks, the wife of famous Hollywood director Howard Hawks, who thought the young woman had the perfect look for her husband's upcoming film projects. Slim Hawks showed the magazine cover to her husband and suggested he should reach out to this striking model for a possible screen test. Howard Hawks was intrigued enough by what he saw that he agreed to have his office contact the girl, but he only wanted his secretary to make a simple phone call to gauge her interest in coming to Hollywood for an audition. The plan was straightforward. Call her up, explain the opportunity, and see if she would be willing to travel to California at her own expense for a meeting. However, Hawks' secretary completely misunderstood the instructions, and instead of picking up the phone, she mailed Bacall a first-class plane ticket to Los Angeles, along with a note explaining that she had been selected for a screen test. When Bacall received the unexpected ticket in the mail, she was shocked but figured this must be how Hollywood normally operated. She had never been on a plane before and had certainly never imagined that a major film director would pay for her travel based solely on a magazine photograph. The mix-up worked out perfectly for everyone involved, because when Bacall arrived in Hollywood and took her screen test, Hawks immediately recognized her star potential and signed her to a 7-year contract worth $100 per week. Fact 3. The medical condition named after her. Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart have the unusual distinction of having a legitimate medical condition named after them, and it's directly related to the vocal damage they both suffered from their famous movie voices. Bogart-Bacall syndrome, officially recognized by medical professionals, is a form of muscle tension dysphonia that occurs when people habitually speak in a pitch that's much lower than their natural vocal range, causing long-term damage to the vocal cords and surrounding muscles. The condition most commonly affects professional voice users like actors, singers, television presenters, and radio hosts who feel pressured to maintain an artificially deep-speaking voice for their careers. Medical researchers found that this syndrome is actually more prevalent among women than men, largely due to what they describe as social pressure on professional women to compete with men in the business arena by adopting deeper, more authoritative-sounding voices. Both Bacall and Bogart developed this condition because they spent decades speaking in voices that were significantly lower than what came naturally to them. Bogart had trained himself to speak in his characteristic gravelly tone to project toughness and masculinity on screen, while Bacall had been forced to completely reconstruct her voice from its original high pitch to the sultry, throaty sound that made her famous. The constant strain of maintaining these unnatural vocal registers eventually caused permanent changes to their throat muscles and vocal cord function. The syndrome manifests as chronic hoarseness, vocal fatigue, throat pain, and that distinctive raspy quality that both actors became known for in their later years. What audiences interpreted as natural aging or the result of smoking was actually the sound of damaged vocal cords struggling to function properly. Medical professionals now use the term Bogart-Bacall syndrome when diagnosing patients who present with similar symptoms caused by chronic vocal abuse, making these two Hollywood legends a permanent part of medical textbooks and voice therapy training programs. Fact 4. She was taller than Humphrey Bogart. Lauren Bacall stood 5 feet 8.5 inches tall, making her a full half-inch taller than Humphrey Bogart, which created an unusual dynamic both on and off screen that Hollywood had rarely dealt with before. During the 1940s and 50s, the average height for leading actresses was around 5 feet 4 inches, and studios typically cast women who would look appropriately petite next to their male co-stars. Bacall's height was so uncommon for actresses of that era that it immediately set her apart from other starlets and presented unique challenges for cinematographers and directors. The height difference became particularly noticeable when Bacall wore heels, which was standard for most of her movie roles and public appearances. In many of their films together, camera angles had to be carefully planned to either minimize the height difference or make it work dramatically for specific scenes. Sometimes directors would have Bogart stand on small platforms or boxes during filming, while other times they would position Bacall in ways that made her appear shorter, such as having her sit down or lean against objects during important dialogue scenes. What made this height situation even more interesting was that neither Bacall nor Bogart seemed particularly bothered by it, which was unusual for Hollywood couples of that time period. Many male stars insisted on wearing lifts in their shoes or refused to work with taller leading ladies, but Bogart appeared comfortable with the arrangement. In their personal life, the couple often joked about their height difference, and Bacall would frequently wear high heels even when they attended public events together. The height difference actually worked in their favor for some of their most famous scenes, particularly those intimate close-ups where Bacall would look down at Bogart with that signature sultry gaze. The unusual physical dynamic added to the unique chemistry that made their on-screen partnership so memorable and helped establish a new kind of romantic pairing in Hollywood films. Fact 5. Her signature look was born from terror. The sultry, seductive gaze that became Lauren Bacall's trademark and launched her to instant stardom was actually the result of pure nervousness and stage fright, not any calculated attempt to create a signature look. During her very first screen test for To Have and Have Not in 1944, 19-year-old Bacall was so terrified of being in front of the cameras that her entire body was shaking uncontrollably, particularly her head and hands. She had never acted in a major film before and was completely overwhelmed by the pressure of performing opposite Humphrey Bogart, who was already one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Bacall later explained in interviews that she discovered the only way to stop her head from trembling visibly was to press her chin down against her chest as tightly as possible, which kept her head steady enough to deliver her lines without the shaking being obvious on camera. When she needed to look at Bogart or make eye contact during their scenes, she would tilt her eyes upward while keeping her chin pressed down, creating that distinctive pose where she appeared to be looking up through her eyelashes with an intense, smoldering expression. What audiences and critics interpreted as a deliberately seductive and confident look was actually Bacall's desperate attempt to hide her terror and inexperience. She described the technique by saying, "I realized that one way to hold my trembling head still was to keep it down, chin low, almost to my chest, and eyes up at Bogart." The pose worked so well at masking her nervousness that director Howard Hawks and the studio publicity department immediately recognized its appeal and began marketing her using this exact expression. The look became so closely associated with Bacall that it was featured prominently in movie posters, publicity photographs, and promotional materials for the rest of her career, even though it originated from nothing more than a young actress trying to control her stage fright during her first day on a movie set. Fact 6. She lived where John Lennon was murdered. Lauren Bacall lived in the Dakota, one of New York City's most famous and exclusive apartment buildings. For 53 years, from 1961 until her death in 2014, making her a witness to one of the most shocking celebrity murders in history. The Dakota, located on the Upper West Side of Manhattan directly across from Central Park, has been home to countless famous residents over the decades, but it became tragically notorious on December 8, 1980, when John Lennon was shot and killed right outside the building's main entrance. On that December evening, Bacall was inside her 9-room apartment when she heard what sounded like a loud bang echoing through the building's courtyard. In a later interview, she explained that she had met Lennon several times around the building and liked him a lot, as they were neighbors who would occasionally run into each other in the hallways or lobby. However, when she heard the gunshot that night, she simply assumed it was a car tire bursting or a vehicle backfiring on the street outside, which wasn't uncommon in the busy Manhattan neighborhood. Bacall went about her evening routine without giving the sound much thought, and it wasn't until she turned on the 11 o'clock news that she discovered the horrifying truth about what had actually happened just outside her front door. She later described the shock of realizing that the noise she had dismissed so casually was actually the sound of her neighbor being murdered by a deranged fan who had been waiting outside the Dakota for hours. The building had paid $68,000 for her apartment when she first moved in, which was considered a small fortune at the time, and she remained there for the rest of her life, becoming one of the Dakota's longest residing tenants despite the tragic associations the building would forever carry. Fact 7. She was related to an Israeli prime minister. Lauren Bacall had a surprising family connection to one of Israel's most important political leaders, as she was related through her father's side to Shimon Peres, who would go on to become both prime minister and president of Israel. This connection came through the Perska family name, which both Bacall and Peres shared, though they spelled it slightly differently due to immigration and name changes that were common when Jewish families moved to different countries in the early 20th century. Bacall's father, William Persk, was born in New Jersey to parents who had emigrated from Volozhin, which was a predominantly Jewish community located in what is now Belarus. Shimon Peres was born Simon Persky in a small town that was then part of Poland, and his family also traced their roots back to the same general region of Eastern Europe where many Jewish families lived before the massive immigration waves of the late 1800s and early 1900s. The exact nature of their family relationship isn't precisely documented, but genealogical research suggests they were likely distant cousins who shared common ancestors from several generations back. This type of extended family connection was quite typical among Jewish families from that part of Eastern Europe, where small communities often had multiple families with shared lineages who then scattered across the globe during periods of persecution and economic hardship. Shimon Peres went on to become one of Israel's founding fathers and most influential politicians, serving as prime minister 3 separate times and later as president from 2007 to 2014. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1994 for his efforts to create peace in the Middle East. Meanwhile, his distant relative was becoming one of Hollywood's most iconic actresses, creating an interesting contrast between two very different but equally notable career paths that emerged from the same family tree. Fact 8. She inspired Jessica Rabbit's character. Lauren Bacall was one of 4 classic Hollywood actresses who directly inspired the creation of Jessica Rabbit, the sultry animated femme fatale from the 1988 film Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Along with Veronica Lake, Julie London, and Rita Hayworth, the animators and character designers at Disney specifically studied these 4 actresses when they were developing Jessica Rabbit's look, voice, and mannerisms, wanting to create a character that embodied the essence of Hollywood glamour from the 1940s and 50s. Bacall's contribution to Jessica Rabbit's character can be seen most clearly in the animated character's signature pose and attitude, particularly that sultry, confident way of looking directly at the audience with a slightly lowered chin and upward gaze that became Bacall's trademark. The animators were fascinated by how Bacall could convey both vulnerability and strength in a single expression, and they incorporated this duality into Jessica Rabbit's personality and visual design. The character designers also drew inspiration from Bacall's sophisticated speaking style, and the way she delivered dialogue with perfect timing and just the right amount of mystery. While Jessica Rabbit was ultimately voiced by actress Kathleen Turner, the character's mannerisms and overall screen presence were heavily influenced by the four classic actresses, with each contributing different elements to create the final animated character. Veronica Lake provided the inspiration for Jessica's iconic peekaboo hairstyle, Rita Hayworth contributed to the character's curves and sensual movement, and Julie London influenced Jessica's sultry singing voice and musical numbers. However, Bacall's influence is most evident in Jessica Rabbit's confident attitude, and the way she commands attention in every scene, reflecting the same kind of magnetic screen presence that made Bacall one of Hollywood's most memorable leading ladies during the golden age of cinema. Fact 9. She predicted her own romance at age 13. When 13-year-old Betty Perske went to see the movie Marked Woman in 1937, she had no idea she was looking at her future husband, but she made a remarkably prophetic statement that would come true just 7 years later. The film starred Bette Davis, who was already one of Bacall's favorite actresses, but it was the male lead who caught her attention in a completely unexpected way. Humphrey Bogart played the role of a tough district attorney fighting organized crime, and his performance made such a strong impression on the young girl that she turned to her friend sitting next to her in the theater and made a declaration that seemed impossibly ambitious at the time. "I'm crazy about that man," she told her friend while watching Bogart on screen. "Just crazy about him. I love Davis, but I should play opposite him." This wasn't just typical teenage crush talk, because Bacall was already seriously interested in acting and had been studying the performances of her favorite stars with the intention of learning from them. She was particularly drawn to strong, independent female characters like the ones Bette Davis played. And she could envision herself in similar roles, alongside leading men like Bogart. What makes this prediction even more remarkable is that at the time, Bogart was 38 years old and already an established Hollywood star, while Bacall was just a 13-year-old girl from the Bronx with big dreams but no connections to the movie industry. The age difference of 25 years seemed to make her prediction not just unlikely but practically impossible. Yet just 7 years later, 19-year-old Lauren Bacall would find herself cast as the female lead in To Have and Have Not, opposite 44-year-old Humphrey Bogart, exactly as she had predicted. Their on-screen chemistry was so powerful that they fell in love during filming and married the following year, making her teenage prediction one of the most accurate cases of manifesting destiny in Hollywood history. Fact 10. Frank Sinatra dumped her over a leak. Frank Sinatra abruptly ended his engagement to Lauren Bacall when news of their upcoming marriage was leaked to gossip columnists, but he wrongly blamed her for the leak when it was actually her well-meaning friend who had revealed the information. After Humphrey Bogart's death in 1957, Bacall began a romantic relationship with Sinatra, who was one of Bogart's closest friends and had been part of their inner circle for years. The relationship developed quickly, and Sinatra proposed marriage to the widow, which seemed like a natural progression given their shared grief and long friendship. However, both Bacall and Sinatra had agreed to keep their engagement completely private until they were ready to make an official announcement, understanding that the media attention would be intense given their high profiles and the relatively short time since Bogart's death. The plan was working perfectly until Bacall went out for dinner with her friend Irving Swifty Lazar, a well-known Hollywood agent and socialite, who was known for his connections throughout the entertainment industry. During their evening out, they encountered Luella Parsons, one of the most powerful gossip columnists in Hollywood, who had the ability to make or break careers with her reporting. Without consulting Bacall first, Lazar excitedly revealed the engagement news to Parsons, apparently thinking he was doing his friend a favor by getting positive publicity for the upcoming marriage. The next day, headlines across the country announced, "Sinatra to marry Bacall," completely blindsiding the singer who had specifically wanted to control how and when the news became public. Sinatra was furious and immediately assumed that Bacall had been the source of the leak, despite her protests of innocence. He ended their relationship that very day and refused to speak to her for months afterward. It was only decades later that Sinatra learned the truth about what had actually happened, but by then it was too late to repair the damage that had been done to their relationship. Fact 11. She got her first Oscar nomination at 72. Lauren Bacall had to wait an astonishing 52 years after making her film debut before she received her first Academy Award nomination, finally earning recognition at age 72 for her supporting role in Barbra Streisand's 1996 romantic comedy, The Mirror Has Two Faces. This made her one of the oldest first-time Oscar nominees in Academy history, despite having been a major Hollywood star since the 1940s and appearing in over 50 films throughout her career. The nomination came as a surprise to many industry observers who had long assumed that Bacall had already been recognized by the Academy multiple times during her decades-long career. She had delivered memorable performances in classic films like The Big Sleep, Key Largo, and How to Marry a Millionaire, but none of those roles had earned her Oscar recognition during what many consider the peak years of her career in the 40s and 50s. In The Mirror Has Two Faces, Bacall played Hannah Morgan, the vain and overbearing mother of Streisand's character, delivering what many critics considered one of her finest performances. Her portrayal was both funny and heartbreaking, showing a former beauty struggling with aging while dealing with complicated family relationships. The role allowed her to display both her comedic timing and dramatic depth in ways that many of her earlier films had not. Bacall was widely expected to win the Oscar that year, having already taken home the Golden Globe and Screen Actors Guild Award for the same performance. However, in what many considered a major upset, she lost to Juliette Binoche for The English Patient. The loss was particularly disappointing because it seemed like the Academy's last chance to honor one of Hollywood's Golden Age legends with a competitive Oscar. She would later receive an honorary Academy Award in 2009, but many felt that her first nomination should have resulted in a win after such a long and distinguished career. Fact 12. Warner Brothers called her insolent. Studio head Jack Warner officially described Lauren Bacall as insolent in company memos and meetings because she consistently refused to accept film roles that she considered beneath her standards, leading to multiple suspensions and bitter contract disputes throughout the late 1940s. During the height of the Hollywood studio system, actors were essentially owned by the studios that held their contracts, and they were expected to appear in whatever films the executives assigned to them, regardless of the quality of the script or the appropriateness of the role. Bacall's problems with Warner Brothers began almost immediately after her breakout success in To Have and Have Not, when the studio tried to capitalize on her instant stardom by rushing her into any project that might make money. She was particularly upset when they cast her in Confidential Agent in 1945, which she knew was a terrible script that would damage her reputation. The film turned out to be such a disaster that even Bacall later admitted it nearly destroyed her career before it really got started. Rather than learning from this mistake, Warner Brothers continued to offer her mediocre scripts, and Bacall continued to turn them down, resulting in a 6-year battle between the actress and the studio. Each time she refused a role, the studio would suspend her without pay and add additional time to her contract, effectively extending her period of obligation to them as punishment for her defiance. Warner's use of the word insolent reflected his frustration with an actress who dared to prioritize artistic integrity over financial gain, which was almost unheard of for young stars at that time. Most actors, especially newcomers, would accept any role they were given out of fear that refusal would end their careers. Bacall's willingness to fight the studio system was considered revolutionary behavior, and it eventually forced Warner Brothers to allow her to buy out her contract in 1951, giving her the freedom to choose her own projects. Fact 13. She declined Grauman's Chinese Theater honor. Lauren Bacall shocked Hollywood executives when she turned down the prestigious opportunity to place her handprints and footprints in the famous cement forecourt at Grauman's Chinese Theater. Despite the huge success of How to Marry a Millionaire in 1953, the invitation to participate in this iconic Hollywood tradition was considered one of the highest honors a movie star could receive, and virtually every major celebrity eagerly accepted when they were selected for this permanent commemoration of their career achievements. Grauman's Chinese Theater, located on Hollywood Boulevard, had been home to movie premieres and handprint ceremonies since the 1920s, and having your prints preserved in cement alongside legends like Mary Pickford, Clark Gable, and John Wayne was seen as the ultimate symbol that you had truly made it in Hollywood. The theater's forecourt was already filled with the handprints of the biggest names in entertainment, making an invitation to join them an almost unrefusable honor. However, Bacall felt strongly that she had not yet earned the right to be included among these legendary performers, explaining that she believed anyone with a picture opening could be represented there. Standards had been so lowered, and that she did not feel that she had yet achieved the status of a major star. She was concerned that the honor had become too common, and that she was not yet worthy of being placed alongside the truly great stars of cinema history. Her decision was particularly surprising because How to Marry a Millionaire had been a massive box office success and critical hit, establishing her as a major comedy star alongside Marilyn Monroe and Betty Grable. Despite this success, Bacall maintained that she needed to prove herself further before accepting such a significant honor, demonstrating the high standards she held for herself throughout her career and her refusal to accept recognition that she felt was premature or undeserved. Fact 14. Her final role was seducing Peter Griffin. Lauren Bacall's final acting performance came in March of 2014, just 5 months before her death, when she provided the voice for a character named Evelyn in the animated comedy series Family Guy, in an episode called Mom's the Word. This marked a surprising and somewhat ironic end to a career that had begun 70 years earlier with sophisticated film noir roles opposite Humphrey Bogart, as her last character was a flirtatious elderly woman who makes inappropriate advances toward the show's main character, Peter Griffin. In the episode, Evelyn is introduced as a close friend of Peter's recently deceased mother, Thelma, and she comes to console Peter during his time of grief. However, the situation quickly becomes uncomfortable when Evelyn, who has recently widowed herself, begins making romantic overtures toward Peter, including an awkward and inappropriate kiss that leaves him confused about his feelings. The storyline was typical of Family Guy's irreverent humor, which often features unexpected and uncomfortable situations for comedic effect. What made this final role particularly notable was how Bacall fully embraced the absurdity of the situation, using her famous sultry voice and seductive delivery to bring the character to life in a way that played perfectly with her legendary screen persona. Even at age 89, she was able to channel the same confident, alluring energy that had made her famous decades earlier, though now it was being applied to a completely different type of entertainment. The episode aired on March 9, 2014, making it Bacall's final credited performance before her death in August of that same year. The fact that one of Hollywood's most sophisticated and elegant actresses ended her career by voicing a character trying to seduce a cartoon character demonstrates the unexpected and often surprising directions that long entertainment careers can take. Fact 15. She never actually collected beer steins. One of the most persistent myths about Lauren Bacall's personal life was the widespread belief that she collected beer mugs and stains as a hobby, a rumor that appeared in countless fan websites, reference books, and even official obituaries after her death, despite being completely false. When Time magazine reporter Rebecca Winters directly confronted Bacall about this supposed hobby during an interview, the actress was genuinely shocked and responded with characteristic bluntness, saying that I collect what? Absolutely untrue. You're not serious. I don't drink beer. I've been accused of a lot of things, but that's a new one. The origin of this bizarre rumor appears to have started from misinterpreted photographs of Bacall and Humphrey Bogart at their home during the 1940s, where beer steins can be seen displayed on shelves in the background of some domestic photos. Internet researchers and fan site creators apparently saw these decorative items and assumed they represented a personal collection that belonged to Bacall, when in reality they were likely just part of the general household decor, or possibly belonged to Bogart himself. The false information spread rapidly through online databases and reference materials, eventually becoming so widely accepted that it was repeated without question by journalists, biographers, and entertainment writers for decades. By the time Bacall became aware of the rumor, it had become so entrenched in popular culture that she found herself having to actively deny it in interviews, which only seemed to give the story more attention. This incident demonstrates how easily false information can become accepted as fact in the internet age, particularly when it relates to celebrity trivia and personal details that seem harmless or quirky. The beer stein collection myth became so associated with Bacall that many people who knew very little else about her personal life were familiar with this completely fabricated hobby, showing how persistent and widespread misinformation can become once it enters the cultural consciousness.